You ever wonder why a CEO in Japan makes just a fraction of what a CEO in the US does? Turns out it's not just about economics. Today, we're going to dig into a hidden force that shapes everything from our paychecks to stock prices: national culture. We're diving into some really fascinating research to understand this culture code of finance. So, let's get specific. Why is it that a top CEO in the US so often gets this huge compensation package, just loaded with stock options that reward these high-risk, high-reward plays? Meanwhile, their counterpart over in Germany might get a much more stable, predictable salary. You'd think a big global company would have a standard playbook for this stuff, right? But the reality is way more complex, and it really points to this hidden software that's running our entire financial world.
And look, this isn't just about CEO pay. It's everything. It's how companies raise money, how much debt they're willing to take on, even how they structure bonuses for their employees. For years, the big economic theory was that a best practice should work everywhere. But the data just doesn't back that up. It's like you give every country the same set of tools: a hammer, a saw, a wrench, and they all go off and build something completely different. This simple fact throws a huge wrench in those one-size-fits-all economic models.
So how are we going to solve this puzzle? Well, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll lay out the big global mystery. Then we'll introduce the missing piece of the puzzle, the cultural context. We're going to look at the amazing tool that first helped us actually measure culture, the Hofstede framework, and see how it's evolved. And then finally, we'll connect all the dots to see exactly how these invisible codes are writing the rules of global business. All right, let's jump in. The cultural context. You see, the key to all this isn't buried in some financial report or a spreadsheet. The answer is culture. That's the missing puzzle piece that explains why money works so differently all around the world.
This quote from Nash and Patel really gets to the heart of it. For decades, finance theory was obsessed with what they called the conflict of interests. The classic power struggle between a CEO and the shareholders. But what Nash and Patel are saying is, hold on, you're missing the bigger picture. We need to look at the context of interests. What's the cultural stage that this whole play is set on? Because that context completely changes the rules of the game.
And to really get that context, we have to talk about the sociologist Geert Hofstede. He defined culture as the collective programming of the mind. And that is the perfect analogy. Just think of it like a country's operating system. It's the invisible software running in the background, shaping how everyone thinks, feels, and acts, usually without them even realizing it.
But okay, how do you actually measure a software of the mind? You can't just look at it. You need a system, right? A framework for comparing these cultural programs across dozens of different nations. And figuring that out, well, that's where the real breakthrough happens.
Which brings us to the Hofstede framework. This is the original decoder ring, the tool that first allowed researchers to scientifically map the world's hidden cultural values. So get this. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, Hofstede did something totally brilliant. He conducted this massive survey of thousands of IBM employees in over 70 countries. And the genius of it was this: by studying people inside one single global company, he could filter out the corporate culture and isolate what was truly national culture. From this mountain of data, 4 key dimensions emerged. You can think of them as 4 core sliders that define a country's cultural programming. So first up is individualism versus collectivism. And this is basically asking, is the culture built around the I or the we? Think about the United States, which scores super high on individualism. It's all about personal achievement, standing out from the crowd. Now contrast that with a country like South Korea, where group harmony and loyalty to your family or your company often come first. Next, we have uncertainty avoidance. This one measures how comfortable a society is with the unknown. Cultures with really high scores, like Greece or Japan, they tend to prefer clear rules, job security, lots of structure. They do not like surprises. On the other end of the spectrum, you have cultures with low scores, like Singapore or Denmark. They're much more comfortable with ambiguity, with risk-taking, and with trying new things. The third dimension is masculinity versus femininity. And it's really important to note, this is not about gender. It's about what a society values. A so-called masculine society, like Japan, tends to emphasize competition, achievement, and material success. A feminine society, like Sweden, places a much higher value on cooperation, quality of life, and caring for others. And the last of Hofstede's original dimensions is power distance. This is all about how a society views inequality. In a high-power distance culture, like India, for example, there's a greater acceptance of a clear hierarchy. The boss is the boss, and that's just how it is.
But in a low-power distance culture like Austria, people expect to be consulted, and they're much more likely to challenge authority.
All right, on to our next section, other cultural frameworks. Now, Hofstede's work was a total game changer, but the science didn't just stop there. Think of it like this. He drew the first map, and ever since then, other researchers have been adding more detail and kind of refining the borders.
So while Hofstede's work is the absolute bedrock of all of this, some people pointed out a few limitations. His data is from the 70s, and it was all from one company, IBM. So newer models have come along, they use more recent data, they survey different groups of people like teachers and managers, and they give us an even sharper, more modern picture of global cultures.
And you can see that evolution right here on this chart. We went from Hofstede's study of just IBM employees back in the 70s, to Schwartz looking at teachers, to Project Globe focusing on managers in the 90s. But the really big one today is the World Values Survey. It's this massive, ongoing project that talks to all kinds of citizens, not just one type of employee. This gives us a continuously updated, almost real-time snapshot of how cultural values are shifting across the entire globe.
So now for our final section, culture's impact. We've got the theory, we have the measurement tools. Now for the most important part. How does this abstract cultural software actually translate into dollars and cents in the real world? Let's go back to that software of the mind analogy. That program, it's always running. It creates a country's social norms, that unwritten rulebook for what's considered fair, what's seen as ambitious, what success even looks like. And that rulebook has a direct and incredibly powerful influence on billion-dollar corporate decisions. Here's exactly how that chain reaction works. You start with a cultural value, like high individualism in the US. That value creates a social norm that celebrates individual, almost heroic achievement. So what happens inside a company? They create policies that reflect this, right? Like massive stock option packages for their CEOs, directly tying a huge reward to one single person's performance. You can literally draw a straight line from an abstract cultural value right to a CEO's bank account. And this brings us to the single most important lesson from all of this research. The idea that financial policies are one size fits all is, well, it's a myth. There is no universal playbook. What works in Silicon Valley might be a complete and total disaster in Seoul. Culture isn't just some side note, it is the context, it's everything. So we'll leave you with this to think about. We've just seen how this invisible cultural software programs something as massive as global finance. It kind of makes you wonder, what else in your world, from how your city is designed, to how your schools are run, to maybe even your own personal definition of success, is being quietly shaped by a cultural code you've never even seen?